misfires. Plum beats Johannes on the glass.
It begins with a phone call that was never meant to become public. A private moment with no cameras, no headlines, and no public acknowledgement. Yet one that supposedly marked a major turning point in women's basketball.
Wilson in the paint.
For close to a decade, Aya Wilson had occupied a position that seemed unquestionable. She was the kind of player every important roster was built around. Not a player who could simply be left out without explanation. But in early 2026, behind closed doors at USA Basketball, that assumption reportedly changed. Wilson's name was left off the team, not because she was injured, not because she needed rest in the usual sense, but because a different choice had been made.
Congratulations!
Big, but
watch out, it's heavy.
MVP.
Into that opening stepped Caitlin Clark, a rising star who, according to this narrative, did not merely take advantage of an opportunity, but shifted the balance of power itself. The story insists this is not only about one roster decision. It is about what happens when a long-established star meets a disruptive new force, when public perception begins to change, and when a sport quietly starts making room for a different face at the top while older legacies begin to feel unsettled. To explain how that happened, the story goes back to 2022.
The quarter for Caitlin Clark. She got another. Second.
When Wilson was at the height of her powers, she had MVP awards, titles with the Las Vegas Aces, endorsement money, magazine covers, and TV analysts who spoke about her as the best player of her generation without hesitation. She was not simply one of the biggest names in the WNBA. In many ways, she represented the league itself. From that position, she had no reason to imagine sharing the spotlight with anyone. Then Caitlin Clark arrived. Clark did not emerge in the slow, respectful way many top prospects do, gradually earning recognition and waiting for the right moment. She burst into national awareness all at once, breaking records, stunning defenses, and attracting attention at a level the sport had rarely seen. Arenas were selling out far in advance, television ratings were climbing sharply, and her deep, three-point shooting became the centerpiece of highlight shows everywhere. Even people who had never watched women's basketball before were setting reminders to tune in for her games. It was a rare cultural moment for the sport, one that could have been embraced as a collective victory. But this account argues that Wilson did not see it that way. Instead of viewing Clark's rise as something that could lift the league as a whole, she is portrayed as seeing it as a personal threat. According to the story, she began treating Clark not as a peer, not as a fellow ambassador for the game, and not even as a competitive rival, but as someone standing directly in the way of her own place in the spotlight. The narrative points to several moments as evidence of that shift. When Clark signed a major Nike deal in 2024, a move that appeared to vault her ahead in visibility and brand power, Wilson posted a Bible verse about patience, while others find success. Clark was not named directly, but the timing was considered revealing. When Clark was later named Time Magazine's Athlete of the Year, which could have been framed as a milestone for the entire women's game,
Their teammates, Wilson getting smothered, and a historical, this woman had seen.
Wilson's reaction was presented not as supportive, but as guarded and skeptical. She began using phrases such as sustained excellence and real impact, language the piece interprets as an attempt to draw a distinction between her own accomplishments and Clark's rapid rise. It also claims she amplified older content about her own achievements at moments that seemed designed to compete with Clark's biggest headlines. None of this, the narrative says, was subtle, and none of it escaped notice. From there, the piece makes a broader claim about jealousy, arguing that no matter how carefully it is hidden, it eventually reveals itself through words, timing, tone, and behavior. It says Wilson made the mistake of turning Clark's success into a personal attack on her own legacy rather than recognizing it as a sign of unprecedented growth for the sport. Meanwhile, according to this story, USA basketball officials were observing all of this carefully and forming their own conclusions. The discussion then turns toward a criticism of Wilson's actual game, particularly in the context of international basketball. While acknowledging that her resume is extraordinary, the story argues that achievements on paper do not automatically translate to success on an international court. Its central claim is that Wilson benefits heavily from a domestic officiating style that rewards offensive contact and protects star players. In the WNBA, according to this view, she has mastered the ability to draw fouls through body control, timing, and an understanding of how officials respond. But the piece argues that in international basketball,
Here's Clark. She fires.
where the game is more physical and referees are less likely to reward that kind of contact, many of those advantages disappear. Team USA scouts, it says, had seen enough in international settings to worry that Wilson's offensive efficiency dropped significantly when she could not rely on the same whistle. Her scoring rhythm, in this account, depended too much on frequent stoppages and friendly calls that do not translate to FIBA play. Caitlin Clark, on the other hand, is described as a player whose game travels anywhere because it is rooted in shot-making, range, court vision, footwork, and decision-making rather than officiating. When Clark scores, the story argues, she does it in ways referees cannot take away. She can pull up from far beyond the arc, create her own looks, pass out of pressure, and finish through contact without depending on a whistle. Her offense is portrayed as self-generated and fundamentally portable, the kind of skill set that works on any court against any style. San Juan is then presented as the clearest proof of that idea. Coming back after 239 days away because of injury, Clark supposedly returned in her first senior national team appearance and immediately posted 17 points and 12 assists in only 19 minutes. A performance used by the story as proof that her talent is not tied to one system, one league, or one style of officiating. The release of the 2026 FIBA World Cup qualifying roster is framed as the moment that made the power shift impossible to ignore. Clark was selected, so were Angel Reese, Paige Buchers, Chelsea Gray, Kelsey Plum, and other established players. Aya Wilson was not. Neither was Breanna Stewart. Although USA Basketball explained the decision as part of a plan to rest some veteran stars while giving younger players international experience, the story emphasizes that Stewart still participated in training camp activities and supported the group, while Wilson was portrayed as entirely removed from the process. According to unnamed sources referenced in the piece, Wilson reacted strongly when she learned she had been left off. The narrative describes frantic phone calls, urgent attempts by her representatives to get explanations, and a wave of emotional fallout that reportedly lasted several days. In the framing of the story, the deeper sting was that the exact player Wilson had allegedly tried to minimize was now being elevated in her place. Clark, meanwhile, is shown as responding in the opposite way. She did not post cryptic comments, demand answers, or try to control the narrative. She simply played, and she played at a level that, according to the story, removed any doubt that her game could thrive beyond the WNBA environment. Team USA went undefeated across 5 games and won by an average of 42 points. Clark led the event in assists, shot efficiently, and operated as the central organizing
Keep your eye on in this matchup on the big
force within a system that Coach Carol Lawson reportedly built around her vision and basketball intelligence. When the tournament ended, Clark received the MVP award, and the story insists that honor was not a media stunt or popularity prize, but a recognition that she had genuinely been the best player on a team loaded with elite talent, especially in a format where FIBA rules took away many of the advantages domestic stars often enjoy. Wilson's side, according to the piece, then tried to explain her absence through scheduling issues, but the narrative treats that explanation as unconvincing and says most people saw it as an effort to save face. Clark, by contrast, is described as responding with gratitude, humility, and excitement about representing her country. From there, the story broadens its argument and says international basketball tests far more than skill. It tests composure, maturity, self-control, and the ability to carry the emotional pressure of representing an entire country under global scrutiny. In that setting, the narrative argues, a a player who reacts poorly to online criticism, struggles with another player's success, or lets ego shape their behavior becomes a serious risk to team chemistry. This is where the story says USA basketball coaches drew an important line. They understood in this telling that international teams can fall apart not because they lack talent, but because one damaging personality can disrupt the entire environment. The piece then points to Wilson's public comments in late 2025 about the history of black women in the WNBA being erased by the coverage surrounding Clark. It acknowledges that the broader issue she raised was legitimate and important because the women who built the league absolutely deserve recognition. However, the argument is that the way Wilson delivered that message, along with the timing and the emotional edge behind it, suggested to coaches that she was blending a real cultural concern with a personal rivalry. Clark, by contrast, is described as having used her own time recognition to explicitly credit the black women who came before her, naming them and refusing to make the moment only about herself.
Or left ankle, rather. But Caitlin Clark just went down and holding her.
The story presents that contrast as evidence of a major difference in temperament. Wilson's reported reaction to being omitted from the roster is then treated as confirmation of those concerns, rather than responding with professionalism and motivation. She is portrayed as responding with anger, demands, and spin through the press. The writer invites the audience to imagine that same volatility after painful loss on the Olympic or World Cup stage, and suggests that USA basketball coaches imagined exactly that scenario and decided they were unwilling to risk it. The focus then returns again to Clark and her comeback. She entered the tournament after 239 days away from competitive basketball following a groin injury, an ankle bone bruise, and a disrupted 2025 season in which she played only 13 games and missed the playoffs. During that time, the Indiana Fever had to sit and watch their franchise player recover while the league moved on without her. Yet, even without Clark on the floor, WNBA viewership reportedly continued to rise, which the story uses to argue that the game itself had grown. Still, it insists that everyone understood Clark's return would elevate the conversation once again. That is exactly what happened. Her immediate production in San Juan is presented not simply as a successful comeback, but as a forceful statement that erased doubts about rust, fitness, or whether her long-range shooting and elite court vision could survive months of inactivity. By the time Team USA finished a perfect run and defeated Spain in the final, Clark had clearly become the team's engine. Not the older names, not the decorated veterans, but the 23-year-old from Iowa who had reportedly dreamed of this moment since childhood. The piece then highlights the chemistry among Clark, Angel Reese, and Paige Buchers as a sign of the future. Their connection, built through years of college competition and mutual respect, is presented as something genuinely healthy and productive, the kind of dynamic that thrives when no one is obsessed with hierarchy or individual control. Reese contributed on the glass, Buchers brought defensive activity and creation, and Clark directed the game with the kind of passing and feel that makes everyone around her better. According to the story, there was no status struggle, no ego battle, and no insistence that the offense revolve around a single player's numbers. Instead, there was a group of talented young stars committed to each other and to the team. That picture is then extended forward into the 2026 FIBA World Cup in Berlin and the 2028 Olympics in Los Angeles. The story argues that this younger core now represents the direction of the national program. Kara Lawson is described as building around versatility, pace, spacing, and intelligence, all areas where Clark is portrayed as exceptional. Wilson, by contrast, is framed as increasingly out of step with that future. The final sections compare the broader effect each player has on the sport. Wilson, the piece argues, mostly appeals to an existing fan base that already follows the game. Clark, however, is portrayed as a transformational figure who attracts entirely new viewers, people who had never watched a WNBA game, cared about a World Cup qualifier, or followed women's basketball before. In a sport constantly fighting for visibility, sponsorships, and cultural attention, That difference is described as enormous. The qualifier between the United States and Great Britain is cited as the most watched non-final game in the event's history, which the piece presents as more evidence of Clark's global draw. The ending makes its central claim as clearly as possible. Wilson may still have the stronger resume, but Clark now represents the future, and in sports the future eventually takes over. Power, the story says, does not always disappear in dramatic fashion. Often it shifts quietly, through decisions made away from the spotlight, long before the public fully understands their importance. From that point of view, Wilson's omission was not just a roster move. It was a sign that women's basketball is undergoing a deeper recalibration of influence, leadership, value, and identity in an era where every action and every reaction is examined more closely than ever. On the other side of that shift stands Caitlin Clark, not merely rising in popularity, but redefining what power in the sport now looks like. She is not simply asking to inherit the throne, according to this narrative. She is changing what the throne means. And as the sport moves toward Berlin, Los Angeles, and whatever comes after, the final question remains whether the next major player left off a roster will be excluded because of performance alone, or because the changing balance of power has already determined that a new era has fully arrived.